Hello, everyone. So today we are looking at women and art in the 18th century. So we're going to be looking at a little bit of the background here. I'll show you the topics here. The kind of historical background of what's going on. And then we're going to be looking at a couple periods, the Rococo period, Enlightenment movement period, as well as the women artists on this list. So in order to get started with this, we're going to, actually before we get to Versailles, there are several periods, not periods, but events, larger events that are taking place during this time. And we can't cover them all. It would be, that could be a whole, you could have a whole multi-part series just on each century. But I wanted to at least provide like at least some of the big things that were going on, right? So you have, obviously I mentioned the Enlightenment movement, which is going to challenge absolute rule. And as said here, promoted reason, science, individual rights. The whole idea of individual rights or the inalienable rights was a new thing that developed during this time, and specifically is going to challenge the whole concept of absolute rule. And that's going to change not only, of course, society and history, because it leads to influencing the American Revolution and the French Revolution, but also changes the art structure from the Rococo period to neoclassicism. You have a different type of feel to a degree. I mean, it's not like everyone changes, but there is a new movement that takes place in the art world because of this shift to enlightenment. And then, as I mentioned, the American French revolutions that fought for independence and democratic principles, which was a whole new concept in that really area because it hadn't been questioned, to kind of challenge absolute rule. You have industrialization, the shift to agrarian to industrial economies, which creates a whole new system of art too, looking at cities and industrialization, also the pastoral movement of looking at kind of idealizing the agrarian society, right? All the progress and structure. There was a realization that the early industrialization was pretty dirty, and the cities and with the factories were somewhat soul crushing. And so, not surprising, there was somewhat of a romanticized notion of agrarian society, which was hard in its own right. And that was shown through the artwork as well. And then, of course, colonial expansion, European powers expanded into colonial territories, and the Atlantic slave trade. All were going on in this period. And there's other things too, but those are some of the large ones that were taking place. And all of these impacted in how people responded to and expressed art based on these events. So what we're going to look at is we're going to go just a little bit before the 18th century and look at absolute rule, although it does go into the 18th century, especially in France, where it continues on until the French Revolution. So to give you, and that's important because it certainly influences the Rococo movement and the type of art that's going on there as that changes over time. It also influenced art before that. So absolute rule or absolutism is kind of the idea that the king has absolute rule, that they have, by the right of God, through religion, justified legitimate right to rule as king, and kind of the whole idea of like his word is law comes into play. Like there's no barriers to the rules and laws of the king. The king can make what laws he wants. He can make the choices he wants, and there isn't any kind of restrictions, right? A constitutional monarchy puts restrictions on the monarch for what he can and cannot do. And absolutism, the ruler can do what he wants. The best example of this is Louis XIV in Versailles. In Versailles, there's the Palace of Versailles. And the Palace of Versailles is probably the best example with Louis XIV of absolute rule, because what he does is as much as you have religion and stating that the king can have absolute rule, that's always not 100% of a surefire thing to get people to agree that that should continue. So Louis takes and builds out Versailles, the Palace of Versailles, and moves all the nobility to Versailles from Paris, and uses the architecture and the artwork and the pageantry of the events in the palace to as again as propaganda to reinforce his right to rule. And so the artwork during this period is very much centered on that. I'll come back to that in a minute a little bit more. So the Palace of Versailles, the nobility and the court was in Paris, and Versailles was a small like hunting lodge that his grandfather or grandfather I think had built, and it was not super large. And Louis decided to expand extensively the Palace of Versailles. And if you ever go to France, visit the Palace of Versailles. It's amazing. Besides the palace itself, the garden area is awesome as well. And then there's other buildings that were like the Queen's summer villa. And the king had one too. So they had their own like separate houses on the property outside of the palace itself. It was the largest building in Europe. And it has 230 acres of gardens, right? So when I'm talking about size, right, this thing is massive. And to show you just like the kind of extreme nature of this, right? He was too impatient to wait for like trees to be planted and grow. So he had over 25,000 fully grown trees transplanted to Versailles so that they would already be fully grown rather than waiting the years for that all to develop out. There was also 1,400 fountains at one point. And then the gardens were pristinely kept and cultivated. And the inside of the palace was decorated, as you can see here. Every room is elaborately decorated with art. The architecture is super impressive for the time. It was meant to be this awe-inspiring place that showed power, which is exactly what it does. And the purpose was to control the nobility through that beauty, through that pageantry, and the time consumption that they had to spend there. So he moved the court there, and they lived there. And it was meant to separate them from everything. But then the nobility had to compete with the king's attention and affection. Everything was curated and planned. At dinners, the major nobility had to eat with him, and where you sat at dinner showcased how he had like pleasure with you or was displeased with you. There was what was called basically the morning wake, and then the nighttime. I don't the name of it exactly though. There's a nighttime practice too. So basically, the favored nobility were selected in the morning to be in the king's bedroom. Although like usually he'd sleep somewhere else and then he'd get up and go lie in the bed, and then the selected nobility would show up and they would help him get up in the morning and get changed and get ready. And then they had the nighttime routine, which was the same thing, which was to help him get ready for bed. And they literally had these like viewing stages for them to the whole idea was that the king and queen's life was on display. And in fact, the palace was even opened up to the commoners occasionally to observe them at dinner time, to be able to view this as well. But that was not an everyday thing like the nobility. But it was meant to be this idea that they were part of this process. And the goal was to keep them focused on competing for his approval, rather than, raising up military to challenge him. They also had the whole aspect of, for women and the queen, was that the queen would wear all these elaborate dresses that were super expensive. And the women were expected to, noble women were expected to spend a fortune on clothing to try to match the queen, who wore different dresses almost every day. And again, there was that expenditure of wealth. And then, as I mentioned, art was commissioned to highlight the king, his religious justification for absolute rule, his power, his prestige, all of that. Because of this, women, there was not a lot of opportunity for individualism or creativity in the art, right? Because it was all about propaganda and the idea of service to the state. So the artwork wasn't to express oneself or ideas. You were to promote Louis and France. And it was all centered around that propaganda and glory of France. The Academy essentially brought the fine arts, right, directly under the state bureaucracy so that they controlled that. And training in the arts was only available to men, specifically because there was an emphasis on nude models was part of the training that was necessary to be in the employ of the king. You had to go through the academy, and the academy had training of nude models, which, because it was seen as an important part of understanding the human body, to be able to paint properly these gorgeous, elaborate pieces. But of course, that meant that women were not allowed to be in the academy because of the nude models. It was seen as not appropriate for women to participate in that. And because only approved academy artists could paint and be employed for the king, that meant women were not going to be employed for Louis XIV. We'll see that changes with a different Louis. And if you ever forget one of the French kings, and you don't remember the number, just say Louis. You'll be correct most of the time. There's lots of Louis. So a different Louis that will change, but under Louis XIV, it was very regimented, it was very restricted, and not really available to women at all because of the control with the state bureaucracy and the academy and the nude models with all of this. So that's kind of that starting point, right, where things were there with that. What changes, of course, is going to be with his death. And when he does die, the state control on the academy and the use of art for propaganda lessens and becomes more favorable for women, and specifically is connected to the kind of transition to the Rococo period. That does then create an environment that's more favorable for women and open up some additional opportunities for this. Now, it was the thing with this was that there were still a lot of restrictions for women during this period. They weren't allowed to access the major art academies because, again, still male nude sketches and paintings were central to the training and creation of what was considered professional artists. So those who were going to get commissions, right, were going to be seen as the professional artists. And in order to be seen as a professional artist, you needed to usually go through the academy. It's not surprising, though, that women were still able to become artists. They just struggled to be seen as professional artists, which limited some of the access to what they could do, but was far more than what it had been under Louis XIV. And most of the women that were able to make a name for themselves during this period were women who had family, specifically fathers usually, but it could be any kind of male family member that wasn't artists themselves, because they often then were trained with that family member. They had access to a studio, so that they got access to training, the studio, and other artists that are all things that you would get in the academy. They were able to get unofficially, and was allowed them to some of their artwork be seen and viewed, and actually gain some notice with that. nonetheless, there were still a few women that were able to make their way and become considered professional artists, and over time are going to actually get added into the academy as well. So the Rococo period, the characteristics of art, this is probably like, this is one that I see as kind of the best example of this period, is you moved away from the state sponsored, propaganda to a more lighthearted theme of myth and upper class courtship, because what happens is you have a lot of nobility that after the death of Louis XIV, they actually move the court back to Paris for a while. They eventually go back to Versailles again, but they're back in Paris for a while. And one of the things is all the nobility are wanting portraits, paintings to decorate their homes. They are enjoying the additional freedom they have. It's still absolute rule, but it wasn't the stranglehold that, again, Louis XIV was like the master at maintaining that control, if you will. And Louis XV did not have that, and it gave the nobility back some freedom and choice. And one of the things that they wanted to do was have this kind of more lighthearted, whimsical kind of artwork, or an emphasis on myth as well. There also was a huge emphasis on interior design and decorative arts that became popularized during this time, which in of itself helped women, because those areas were often seen as more like womanly arts. And so people were willing to purchase art that fit into that less professional, if you will, category from women artists, because that was seen as deemed as more acceptable or normal kind of path. But why this? So this one, again, this idea of this kind of showcasing the wealthy woman, right? Definitely of nobility. You have someone here that's helping her swing. You can tell by her clothing as well, and it's in this kind of light, soft tones with this kind of playful flirtation here going on, right? It was meant to be. It wasn't serious. A lot of the artwork wasn't serious. It was meant to be way more lighthearted in nature, and also showing again the scene of this man and woman kind of flirting, but showing like kind of that wealthy lifestyle of the nobility, having that leisure and free and fun time to not kind of be carefree, to not think of the demands and things that were taking place. So one of the first women we're going to look at is Rosalba Carriera, who fits into that Rococo period and is able to make a name for herself. So she was born in Venice in 1675. So she lived from 1675 to 1752. And she actually didn't have the benefit of wealth or artists in her family, but started working in lace until she switched when lace making declined and moved to decorating ivory snuff boxes. These things were super popular for like a really long time as these mass-produced trinkets that were that people bought for their own personal use, but they also sold to like tourists all the time. Like later, when Benjamin Franklin goes to France during the American Revolution to try to convince France to help them, they start painting his image on snuff boxes and selling them. And they were really basically anything with like Benjamin Franklin references or likenesses or anything sold super fast. He was super popular there. But it was a common like tourist thing that was definitely mass produced because they sold them all over the place. But you had to like hand paint on whatever images that they wanted on these snuff boxes, which sometimes were portraits like of Benjamin Franklin or other people, but also of like scenes of flowers or nature scenes or whatever other type of thing on it that pretty much anything you could think of, they kind of produced with that. So these were super small paintings. These were miniature paintings in themselves. She eventually transitions to miniature paintings like the one that you see here. So that were done in lockets, that were done in small frames that people would put like on their bedside that they could fold up and take with them when they, traveled and stuff like that. Miniature paintings were seen as a fun way to get portraits, family portraits that weren't as expensive as the large scale portraits for that. So she had this, she was able to hone her skill and talent with the snuff boxes and then transition that to the more formal miniature paintings that were done where people would commission artists for this. And a lot of women actually, as artists, were able to get into the miniature paintings because they were not seen as a highbrow type of painting or artwork, essentially. Even though, you can see here with the quality and skill of this miniature here, they clearly were super skilled, impressive paintings. But the Academy had very defined specifications for what a professional artist was and what type of paintings those were. And miniature paintings didn't fit into that. And again, tended to target largely women. There were a few male artists, but those were seen as amateur artists, and it was seen as an amateur type of art, but it was one that women were able to participate in. The small size requires significant control and skill. In fact, you could argue that in many cases, miniature painting is actually harder than the larger canvas paintings because of its size, the precision, and detail is significantly harder to do on a much smaller scale. Rosalba eventually goes blind in her later years, and some argument has been made, and it is speculation. We don't know for sure, but of course the light, levels were not the best back then. And the eye strain and focus and combined with the poor quality light, very possibly could have contributed to her loss of sight later in life. And so she got her what would be considered her main start, obviously with snuff boxes, but her main start in what is considered more art-based than just tourist art was with the miniatures. She eventually shifts to pastel portraits. And they're like the miniatures, there were only a few men that actually used pastels in art. It was a relatively small style of art at this time, and Rosalba used her portraits and used them in unique ways to create a naturalistic range of textures, of detail, of blending in tones that gained her significant recognition within the art community. So that's when her shift to being a recognized artist comes with that transition to the pastel portraits. So this is a self-portrait of her with her sister, who was her assistant. And so you can see kind of here the soft type of tones. You can't get that with the oil painting. It's only with the pastels. One of the things interesting about the pastels at the time is this is a pastel stick, and they actually called it painting. They were really hard sticks that you could sharpen to really get fine lines and the kind of pencil style. So they like I said, pastels were around for a while. They still weren't super common. So it wasn't a brand new art medium. It just wasn't a super common one. But it allowed her to create these really naturalistic ranges of textures And she created a couple different self-portraits that started to gain attention. Notice how in a lot of her portraits, there's a throwback to lace. A lot of her portraits had lace in them, and definitely was, her mom was a lace maker as well. So it was kind of that nod to that background and that knowledge. And so again, she's holding here a portrait of her sister, Giovanna, who was her assistant. And this was commissioned by the Medici Gallery of Self-Portraits and was one of the ones that helped showcase her talent and skill and gets her noticed in the art world. She was invited to Paris by the art collector Pierre Croissat that in 1720 with her mother, sister, and brother-in-law. And at this point, Louis XIV was dead. He'd been dead for 5 years, and the new king, Louis the 15th, was like 10 years old, and the court had moved back to Paris. And the Pierre was a well-connected individual in the art world, and helped not only with like the transition of art style that moved from focusing from the kingship of Louis XIV and that power to the aristocratic decorative style that had that not only helped women start getting into it, but had a more international appeal too. And this is important because, of course, international recognition is like a huge thing. If you're, as an artist, are known locally, right, you might get some commissions, but when you start to get recognized internationally, you kind of move up on that professional level. And that's one of the things that the women we're looking at today all had some level of international recognition, and obviously were accepted into the art community in ways that many women were not at the time. One of the things that helped with this, the portrait era style, was with the nobility moving back to, Paris, as I mentioned earlier. They wanted to decorate their homes. They wanted to have a bunch of artwork displayed, because as soon as they moved back, part of that is there was this push by nobility to show off their wealth and power and control that had previously been all centered on Louis XIV, that now went back to the more traditional way of nobility. This helped usher in the Rococo movement because, again, they wanted that kind of decorative style, the light-hearted style. They wanted things that kind of represented aristocratic ideals, if you will. And so this huge demand led to a ton of commissions by a bunch of different artists and allowed women such as Rosalba to start getting commissions to do portraits that focused on the whimsy and pleasure of the nobility, flowers, garlands, elaborate costumes, stylized manners, showing the freedom and fancy of the world and the freedom that the nobility had with the carefree attitude was all part of that. And Paris had been kind of the center of the artistic world and was reinvigorated with that kind of move of the nobility back to Paris itself. So Rosalba stayed in Paris for a year as part of an international group of artists, and her work certainly was super important to forming that new Rococo style that the nobility wanted. She definitely had the most success as a woman artist during this period in time. She was one of the first artists really to fully explore the aspects of pastel painting. Again, pastels had been around. There were artists, there were even some male artists that used pastels, but no one had done so as extensively as she had. And not just extensively, but as creatively and as well done as she had. And so this again helped attract other people to her art. It also helped that her sister was also an artist, and her brother-in-law was also an artist as well. And she and her brother actually were commissioned to paint a huge allegorical ceiling in the Banque de France. That was again a huge push with showing the Rococo movement. And this actually spread later to England, and King George III was a major collector of her artwork. So again, she was known by kings, and you can also see this in one of her first major commissions in the royal field was with this is King Louis. You can't really see that there, but the 15th, right? So this is King Louis the 15th, and yeah, I'll write it over here because you can't really see. Right, so this King Louis the 15th, and he was, like I said, around 10 years old when he became king, which part of the reason I think some of the lessening of absolute rule took place was because he was so young. He had minders and regents that helped rule in his stead till he was old enough to fully be in charge, and that those were probably largely nobility, and most of the noblemen and women wanted that break and that freedom from Versailles. And so here you can see the portrait commissioned of him, which even, as much as that her artwork was in the Rococo style, this is somewhat of a throwback to not being against, doing a portrait that displays him in this manner that certainly is befitting of a royal. And you could argue maybe goes a little bit back more to the propaganda style, but it played a huge role in pushing her to that international stage and being known by George III to have collections of hers and stuff like that. She ends up being elected into the Académie Royale in October of 1720. Only 7 women had ever been admitted to the Academy before her, and most had been miniature painters or flower painters. So she was really the first woman artist to be admitted on her larger pastel pieces that was seen as a more legitimate art. Now, I'm not saying, like I said, the miniature and flower paintings were legitimate art, but at the time, what was perceived to be legitimate art was not the miniatures or flower paintings. That was seen as women's art. So for her to be elected for her portrait work, specifically her pastel portrait work, she not only then is revolutionizing the more Rococo style, but also at the same time doing it with a medium that it was not typically brought into the Academy and used. And then it was a woman who was being brought in for not the medium, but portrait style, larger scale style artwork was traditionally seen as a male dominated role. So all 3 of those kind of things broke significant barriers in that sense of that. But she definitely benefited from being in this time period that allowed for that freedom of expression and people wanting to collect and experience and have artwork that was different and fresh and new, and with a little bit of whimsy to it. But her contribution was significant to the Rococo movement, to having that kind of spread, and she was very well known in that period. Okay, so what starts to change after this is the Enlightenment movement, and the Enlightenment movement is going to come in and change some of they're going to reject the Rococo movement, and then it's going to shift in favor to neoclassicism. But I want to talk about what Enlightenment was, and then kind of how that influenced women and the art movement, because it had a profound impact on society as a whole, with large reaching consequences. Again, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, but also just the way of thinking about kingship, the way of thinking about education, science, human reasoning, the idea of education and what was called intelligentsia, this idea of intellectual discourse. And that while there was still and always is in any of these periods, there's always going to be pushback against women participating in these movements. The Enlightenment period in its early years was more friendly to women than its later years. And even still in its later years, there were still women that were able to come in and take advantage and participate in this. But in the early years, a lot more women were able to participate in this movement because the ideals initially suggest this support of this. So the main themes of the Enlightenment movement were these here. Oh, there we go. The confidence in human reason. The idea that there should be an emphasis and focus on philosophies, on reasoning, on the human ability of that. The influence of focusing on logic and science, the importance of human rights, specifically, again, that idea of inalienable rights, that everyone had certain inalienable rights was a brand new concept. Prior to the Enlightenment, and even during the Enlightenment, but there was pushback against it. But prior to the Enlightenment, one of the things that was common in many societies was secret, like court cases. So if you were charged with something, there was no innocent until proven guilty. You were basically guilty unless you could prove you were innocent. And many times the trials were held in secret, very quick, super rapid, because you were basically assumed guilty already. And torture was often used to extract confessions, which were obviously, if the tortures are bad enough, most people will say whatever to get it to stop, right? So you had lots of false confessions to things just to get it to stop. And then on top of all of that, they did public executions. Now, again, the public executions don't completely stop with the Enlightenment period, but people start to question it. They question the secret private trials. They question the speed of the trials. They question being guilty without any, support. They question the public executions, and talk about how humans have certain rights that should be protected by the government. And those went against all of those things I just mentioned. There was more criticism of religious institutions. The Enlightenment period was definitely somewhat of a rejection. Not completely. There was also still plenty of religious institutions in belief. But it was definitely a higher period of rejection of religious institutions. And the optimistic hope of progress of human society and self-improvement. That through human reason, through logic and science, society could progress and improve, and not just within like individuals, but with the government as well. Okay, so that is the kind of main themes that took place in that. So not surprisingly, it's going to influence the style of art that shifts away from Rococo, which many people in the Enlightenment period saw as frivolous. And I mean, it was supposed to be whimsical and frivolous to a degree, but they saw it as frivolous in a negative way. Part of this was also because there's a shift to the middle class, which, not surprisingly, didn't have the wealth and leisure of the aristocratic class. And so the other felt like it was flaunting inequality and wealth to the rest of society. And instead, it shifted to neoclassicism, which focused on rationality, morality, classical styles, Also, like classical styles of like Greek and Roman style, there was a throwback to that. Also, a huge emphasis on the depiction of historical scenes and Enlightenment ideals. This is a good example. There were many paintings with what were called salons, and the salons were this good example of these meeting places where artists, writers, philosophers, intellectuals would meet up and have lively intellectual discussions on these topics, but they would also practice their art. Writers would write this. You have actually like Frankenstein was created in one of these salons where writers competed to create like the best horror story. People would share their writings. They would share their artworks. They would meet and paint. They would meet and discuss. And it was meant to be this like kind of intellectual gathering for that. And then there what was called the history or historical painters, which were painters who did these kind of large historical or classical myth scenes, which kind of was seen as for a period, the height of painters and stuff at that point in time. So during this period too, educated women became more visible in public life through these saloons mostly. But just in general, the idea of education, not understandably, if the whole idea was, improving oneself, education became a part of that. And women, it became more acceptable for women to be educated and to show that education. I mean, women were educated, especially the wealthy educated their daughters. But women were kind of in the past meant to not flaunt that. The Enlightenment period allowed women to go to these salons and these social gatherings and discuss and share and debate ideas, share and exchange ideas as artists, as writers, and things like that. These early salons were actually held in women's homes. And there were all female salons as well. Over time, the salons moved from like private homes to public meeting areas in the later part of the Enlightenment period, and this is where the pushback comes in. There were well-known philosophers in the Enlightenment period that were against women participating in the public aspect of life. And participate in the salons. And you do have a decline of women in the salons when they shift to public meeting places. But in the early period, these were in women's homes, then they were the host of the salons. So not surprisingly, as hostess, not only did they open up their homes to this, but it allowed for women to be active participants. Some of the famous early salons was the salon of Madame du Deffand, Madame de Lafayette, and Madame de Châtelet, who were known for their artistic style, their philosophical knowledge, and just general intellectual discourse. But one of the important things with this is, right, salons allowed for this supportive and network of what you could say is like-minded people, right? One of the key aspects of the art world is who you know. If you get in with the right people, artists tended to be set. If you get into the right academy, you're set as a professional artist. Well, that wasn't very different for women either. The difference was it was just harder for women to network and get into these areas that would set them up as professional artists. But if they could get these connections, these were the women who tended to become the professional, well-known international artists that were respected and played an important role. They just had a harder time making those networks and making those, being accepted into those spheres because they were women. but it functioned in almost the exact same way. So these salons and this kind of openness in the early period of the Enlightenment movement for women to be a participant in that played a huge role in women artists coming up and being seen as more legitimate and supportive of those artistic endeavors. Because especially with women in the homes, that these women that held these salons, they were able to hold authority on Enlightenment ideals, on art, and the salons also provided financial aid through commissions and grants to women. So, right, one of the things about being a professional artist is getting paid for your art and getting paid enough to support you in that art, which is hard. It's still hard to this day. And the salons became a central place where funding was raised for artists, for up-and-coming artists, for women artists. The all-women salons set up several grants and financial aid commissions to support women in the arts, not just in paintings, but also in literature. Those are the two main areas, literature and art. Although, interestingly enough, women in literature had a much easier time, even though there was still pushback against them as well. Women writers had an easier time being accepted as professional writers than women painters. And part of this was that the writing sphere didn't have the formal academies and training with the rules of male nude study that the art world did, right? So there was less educational training, formal training or schooling that the literature world, the literary world had at the time than the art world did. So part of that reason why women were barred during this time was because of that restriction, where writers didn't have that. Nonetheless, so even with those restrictions, these saloons played an important role in supporting both men and women and gave them some influence in the art world. Although, like I said, there was eventually pushback towards this as the Enlightenment period continued. And women continued to push against that in a variety of subtle and sometimes very open ways. And we'll see how with that and stuff like that. Oh, I skipped. I was talking about this page. I skipped this slide, and I skipped this one. So I already talked about this. I just didn't switch it over. Sorry. So as you can see here, is just talking about the public life, the salons, the women that I mentioned here. So that one I already covered. So going to the next one. And Angelica Kauffman is the next woman that we're going to be looking at. And she becomes known as a history painter or historical painter. So she was a daughter of a painter, born in Switzerland, and obviously received early training from her father. She was both a talented musician and painter, and in her young teens, felt that she had to make a decision for one or the other, which was very much actually like a male kind of quandary that usually came up if they were in the professional world. Because for men, you had to the idea was to be good enough to have it become your profession or career. You had to have kind of full focus on one thing and become great at that. Whereas women were more expected to be good at many things, but not great at any one thing. In fact, there were articles that were written that specifically talked about how women's role was to be good enough at a lot of different things, but never an expert at one thing, right? Because the idea was if you were an expert at one thing, then you had obviously focused too much on that one thing, and that had limited your ability. Women were supposed to be multifaceted so that they could, appease their husbands, help their children. Society was that you were supposed to be an amateur at multiple things and expert at none. And there were, like I said, there were specific writings that was laid out, that here you should be good at this, and this, and be amateur at these. That's a better thing for women to do. So traditionally, women weren't expected to choose. Like, you were supposed to be good at music and, amateur artwork. That was fine. Those were good skills to have. In fact, one thing talked about how it was good for women to paint, because that, again, was something you could do that was solitary and quiet. It was good for the mind, right? But it's obviously not to be taken seriously as a profession. So, but Angelica, at an early age, was obviously determined to have music or painting become her career. And she ultimately made the decision for painting. And the best example of this, and I have it on the next one, so I'll go to the next slide and then come back to this. This is her self-portrait here. This is the nod to the classical historical aspect of her role, which is again, that intentional. The one thing with portraits is it's always interesting to pay attention to what are they showing, right? This was an opportunity for them to show what they saw as important about themselves, their identity. But one of her paintings that best shows this struggle was, I went the wrong way. What did I do here? Hang on. There we go. I was like, that's not the right painting. Is this painting here, which I mentioned, I wrote it here though, but I wanted to show her self-portrait. Her painting on the artist hesitating between the arts of music and painting. That's this one here. So this idea of her being torn at a crossroads between these two muses, and you can see a painting and of music, and her in the center, essentially being pulled to both of these choices, right? And her having to decide with this. What she had, this painting is adapted from Hercules at the crossroads between fame and luxury. So she took a historical painting and used that as the inspiration for her own decision that she made for her career, which again, now here, I'll go back here, kind of showcased her as more of a professional career style artist, at least how she saw herself at a very young age, to make that decision, right? And more importantly, I think that she intentionally chose this for herself, right? She didn't fall into it. She made this intentional decision to focus on her career like other male professionals would have done, right? That she was taking agency into her own hand to guide her future. So in 1763, Angelica and her father arrived in Rome, where she ended up meeting pretty much all of the leading figures of neoclassicism at the time in its early stages. And so this is important because, again, right, this is that connections and network and timing. We'll put timing too, right? She ends up being, again, the benefit too of her father being a painter that could introduce her to these people. But she ends up creating a network and gets some training and meeting these kind of leading artists, male artists, in the early fledgling years of the neoclassical period of art, that allows her to break into that period, right? She ends up, from there, after having some time studying that, she ends up developing her own neoclassical style that ends up placing her at the forefront of that movement. And then in 1766, she ends up going to London, where she establishes herself as a leading artist of the English school. And when the British Royal Academy was founded, she and Mary Mosier, another woman artist, were the only two women members. So most of the paintings, right, during this time, when I say I keep forgetting to skip to the next slide. So here's where I was talking about and stuff. Most of the paintings at this time, right, had still had the holdover from the Rococo period, which were painted portraits of nobility, and this didn't go away, right? The how they were painted transformed over time. But if you wanted to make money as an artist until you became super well known, you painted portraits of nobility, because that's where you got commissions and got paid the money for that, right? But ultimately her goal was to expand to larger scale paintings with themes on classical and medieval history, which again was a super unique role for women at the time. Most women artists focus on portraits, on miniatures and flowers and stuff like that. Most women, almost no women artists at the time, sought to be the historical painters, because that was seen as, again, decidedly male in nature. And that was her ultimate goal and determination, was to be able to produce at a large scale these historical works. And of course, one of the bigger barriers was that she didn't have the formal training, specifically in the male nude models, which had been the basis of the convention, especially for like the throwback classical artwork of Greek and Roman art, which was really focused on the male form. And female form too, but especially the male form and stuff, and the belief that, again, that was rooted in that idea that you had to be trained in that in order to be seen as taken seriously as a professional artist. So she ends up continuing to paint with what she wanted to do. And she sends another painting that was called Venus appearing to Aeneas, Penelope with the bow of Ulysses, and Hector taking leave, to the Royal Academy. And again, those are Greek and Roman figures and characters in mythology. And impressed with her work, she was asked to contribute to the decoration of the new residence of the Royal Academy. And certainly her success can be attributed both to that networking and things like that, but also her determination to pursue that historical painting, and being able to showcase her skill in that. Her personal life was not as successful. She was seen almost as a I don't know, say a genius, or, she was definitely, she was taken as like an exception. So unfortunately, her success wasn't seen as, look, women can be equal style painters. She was seen kind of as the exception to the rule in some cases, but she was really, really well received. She probably had one of the nicest receptions into the art world. And I think one of the best things that exemplifies this and how well respected she was as an artist was that her first marriage was to someone who pretended to be a Swedish count. His name was I don't remember his name, but he tricked her, and there's different stories. We don't know exactly which ones are kind of myth versus reality, but the main basis of the story is that he tricked her into marrying him. Whether that was through love bombing her and pretending to get her to fall in love with him using false premises, or tricking her as someone to being able to stay in country. Either way, he convinced her to marry him, with her very quickly to discover after the marriage that he was not a real count. And some of the rumors were that he tried to steal her money. And another rumor was that when that failed initially, once he was discovered sooner than he expected to be discovered as a fake count, that he hatched a kidnapping plot that ultimately failed too. Either way, he ends up being paid around £300 to leave her alone and leave the country and never contact her again. And then, so after his death, she ends up marrying Antonio Zucchi in 1781, who was loyal and supportive to her career. They end up moving to Rome, where she ends up staying. In part, that Rome was another area that had a lot of women artists and salons and was still relatively supportive of women artists. But the key, what I wanted to highlight with this, besides just being kind of a crazy, every description of her, she was a super intelligent, super smart, besides, of course, her talent. And so, a lot of people questioned how was she tricked into this. And we don't know, 100%. Again, there's a couple different theories and stories besides what happened. But the point of how popular and well viewed she was as an artist is that for most women, even women artists or women in general, in the nobility, aristocratic, professional world, this kind of scandal, even though it wasn't her fault, right? This type of marriage scandal would have destroyed their reputation, destroyed their no political for women, but, professional ambitions. It could have destroyed political later, but there's not political attempts yet. But it would have destroyed their reputation, their professional aspirations, their name. And instead, she not only survived the scandal, but maintained her reputation and skill and reputation of her skill as a painter, and continued to her work be shown, get commissions. Most women would not have survived this scandal of her first marriage. And yet, while it had personal cost to her, it didn't seem to damage her in the least in her professional life. And that's pretty crazy and impressive because, again, this type of scandal would have been a juicy scandal that people would have been talking about, everyone in the community would have known about. And again, for most women, it would have ruined their reputation and stopped any chance that they had to continue within that world and be taken seriously. And yet it seemed to not really impact her at all. So that's a testament to her skill and how well she was viewed as an artist for her time. All right, the next woman artist that we're going to be looking at is Elizabeth Vigée Lebrun, and she goes in a different direction than Angelica. In that she was a royalist and a huge supporter of Marie Antoinette and the French king and queen and the whole royal system and society. She was around during the French Revolution. And we're going to look at there's two women that were her and one other woman that we're going to be looking at. And they both experienced the French Revolution and went in completely different directions with what they did during the Revolution. So she was born in 1755 to 1842, and she was the daughter of a pastel portrait painter, which in some part had owed that increase in that type of painting to Rosalba earlier on. So you can see that connection and influence there. She actually she was the most successful aristocratic portrait painters. And she ends up becoming the official artist for Marie Antoinette. She ends up studying paintings at the Louvre, which was a huge deal to be able to study at the Louvre. That was one of the ways of being able to obtain that professional artist tag. She was also probably the most prolific painter at the time. She produced around 800 paintings in her lifetime. I mean, that's that is a massive number for any artist, male or female. It doesn't matter. And so she just did so many different paintings and things like that. We'll see with her during the French Revolution. Artists either fled with the royalty or stayed with the new changing French government. She was so tied to Marie Antoinette and her strong, ardent belief and respect for the king and queen that she fled and ends up traveling around Europe for a while during the Revolution and after. She eventually is allowed to return to Paris because multiple artists petitioned to the government to allow her to come back. So she was still well received as an artist as well. However, she doesn't ever regain her former prestige, and she lamented the change with the revolution. She felt, and in her experience, it's legitimate. She felt that women had freedoms and opportunities before the revolution, that the revolution diminished. And in her case, that was very much true. She had prestige, she had wealth, she had, she was the personal portrait painter of Marie Antoinette, which wasn't a one-time thing. She was around the court all the time. So that prestige and power and freedom and independence had to be, like, for her, pretty amazing. Obviously, that's not the case for most women and women artists in general, was that the absolute rule and king and queen structure didn't provide that opportunity for most people, but for her it did. And she, like I said, she specifically wrote and lamented that loss and saw it as a unfortunate end, as she kind of called it the beginning of the end for women and their opportunities and stuff like that. So she, studying at the Louvre, right, allowed her to then be elected to the French Royal Academy in 1783 with Adelaide Labille-Guiard, who is the other woman we're going to look at. And because they were both elected to the French Academy at the same time, there was this, in circles, there was this idea that they were somehow rivals. And certainly they went in opposite directions, but there's no indication that they were major rivals or anything like that. But it got put into popular press that these two women artists were rivals with each other. After they were elected to the French Royal Academy, and this is that pushback again, the men started getting nervous that too many women were being elected into the academy, and so they petitioned to say that no more than 4 women could be elected into the academy a year, because there was this fear that too many women were going to start getting elected into the academy with that. But it was super important to also be elected. Like I said, any of these academies that we've been talking about, these were the ways to be seen as a professional artist. It gave you networking, it gave you commissions, it gave you grants. Every single time that played an important role in women's, or both men and women's careers. And it was especially important for women because it was not a common thing to be elected into. Obviously, all the women we're talking about were elected into these various academies. That was not the norm, though, right? So that's important to remember, right? Out of the entire whole history of the French Royal Academy, only 15 women total were elected. So their whole fears of, oh no, we need to limit how many women are being brought into the academy because they'll soon take over. Well, that clearly never happened. So we're looking at 2, her and then Adelaide, 2 women out of 15 of total women elected into the academy. So it shows you how minuscule those numbers were of women that were actually allowed to have these opportunities for a professional career. But nonetheless, also showcases the kind of like hysteria around women starting to come into these male dominated spheres and them thinking that somehow women are going to take over. And every time a woman was elected, it reinvigorated the debate about how many women should be allowed into the academy and stuff like that. In 1778, she was summoned to the court of Marie Antoinette to paint her portrait. Again, as I mentioned, and this is a great example of that portrait. She painted several portraits of Marie Antoinette. This is probably the most famous one. And this is Marie Antoinette and her children. But she was an ardent royalist, and again, all of her paintings kind of fit that more propaganda structure. And this is a really good example of this. So she ended up what she ended up doing with this is, sorry, I was just looking at this, and this looks like it mixed up two of my, it deleted, it combined my last one. I don't know how that happened. Huh. I'll show you this. This is, it totally deleted so this is wrong, and I'll explain that in a minute. The portrait is correct. It deleted my last slide, and maybe when I put the picture in. So this is for Adelaide. So I was like, wait, this information on here is not for Elizabeth. So I'll fix this and put this back up. So I apologize for that. This must have happened when I put the picture in. Maybe I accidentally put in the wrong picture and then deleted the other slide. I don't know, because this picture is, so this information is for Adelaide, which we're going to get to in just a second, but this portrait is from Elizabeth. So there was supposed to be one more slide with Elizabeth, and then there was a separate slide with the portrait with Adelaide. So I apologize for that and for that confusion. So just so you know, the information, if you're looking at here, when I'm talking about this, I'm not talking about this information that's the writing yet, because that's about Adelaide. But this portrait is with Elizabeth. So sorry for the confusion there. I will fix the slide. I don't know what happened there. So that was where my stumbling was, as I started to look at the slide and go, wait, this information is not for her. But the portrait of Marie Antoinette with her children was painted by Elizabeth. And this portrait came at a time when there was heightened tensions and dislike of the monarchy. And legitimately, like the excess and wealth and just massive consumption of the king and queen at this time was excessive compared to, of course, the poor conditions, the hunger, the starvation, the really poor conditions of the lower classes in France. And like other queens in France before her, part of what Marie Antoinette did was to flaunt the elaborate clothing and dresses and style that had been accepted and emulated in the past under like Louis XIV. But by the time you get to Marie Antoinette, it was now seen with disdain and disgust, and seen as just an example of the over spending and corruption of the monarchy with the revolutionary sentiment that was taking place. So Elizabeth did this portrait to somewhat challenge the slander that started to be spread about Marie Antoinette. And it was. So she ended up getting this very negative reputation, mostly not justified. Like there, you could very much justify the excessive wealth and overindulgence in things that was in poor taste when like the poor were going hungry and not having enough food, and conditions were horrible. You should not be flaunting your wealth while not taking care of your people. That's legitimate. But what some of the charges were that there was attacks of her being promiscuous, on having improper relationships, of poisoning the heir to the throne. And also the most common and the one that she was attacked on the most because she was a woman, was that she was a bad mother. So it's funny, like, as much as the promiscuity and improper relationships and poisoning the heir to the throne we're seeing as bad things, the ones that people got most in a huff about were, oh, she's a horrible mother. And so this portrait was meant to show maternal motherly love of how she has her young children, and that the heir was still alive and not poisoned, and that she was a caring, loving mother, right? She's holding one of her younger kids. It is a little bit sad. The cradle was actually for her infant, who ended up dying not too long before this portrait was made. But you have her daughter lovingly laying on her. She's holding her infant. While the son is a little bit removed, that was common for the heir to the throne. So this was meant to showcase this idea of combating all of those negative critiques of her. However, it came at a time when things were kind of too far gone in that sense. It was meant to be shown in an exhibit in 1787, but the anti-monarchy sentiment at the time was so high and tensions were at such a boiling point that Elizabeth actually refused to showcase this, to display it, because she was afraid that it was actually going to be destroyed. Like, that shows you how close to revolution they were at this point in time. And not long after, revolution did take place. And again, she was just too closely associated and an ardent royalist that she ends up fleeing with, at the same time that the king and queen were imprisoned. So what happens in the French Revolution is that the king and queen are put under house arrest after the king made a series of blunders with the General Assembly that was meeting to look to what they wanted to create at first was a constitutional monarchy. They weren't looking to get rid of the monarchy. And if the king had just accepted that and gone along with it, they would have stayed king and queen, just under now with constitutional rules. It wouldn't have been absolute rule anymore. England had already moved to constitutional monarchy. The French wanted to do that too, so they'd had certain rights. The king pretended he was going to agree to it and then took it back and then looked like he was going to threaten the National Assembly, and this led to them putting him under house arrest. They basically forced him to sign a thing saying he agreed with the constitutional monarchy. But it was too late at that point. They end up escaping house arrest and they start to flee. But they stop along the way at a restaurant not that far out of Paris, and they're seen, and the revolutionaries catch up with them, and then they're locked up, properly locked up, not just house arrest. And then the king is executed, and then Marie Antoinette is executed shortly thereafter. With that, Elizabeth leaves, and that's again where she goes around Europe, and she's painting around Europe for a while before she eventually is allowed back in 1802 to France. And again, multiple male artists and some women artists signed a petition to the new French government to get her back. So she obviously was respected as an artist, even though she was a royalist, and she did come back, but she didn't ever adapt her style or subjects after the revolution. And so she struggled to gain the prestige that she had before. And it would be hard to anyways. I mean, you had the power of the king and queen pre-revolution. No matter what, you're not going back to that. And she kind of longed for that after that. So that's her. So now the last one, Adelaide Labille-Guiard. And again, I apologize that the last slide got all mixed up. So just ignore this picture now. We'll cross it out, right? Okay. So now this information written here, and again, I will go back in and replace the slide. I'll go update it and then replace the slide. So if you're curious, you can see the last image with Adelaide. That was meant to be on this slide, and I'll add the other slide in that somehow got deleted in that swap. So I apologize for that. So Adelaide also, again, was put into the academy at the same time as Elizabeth. And she was actually born to a lower middle class family with no connections to the art world, and she developed her skills over many years. Did not start displaying her oil paintings until she was in her 30s. She started actually works in miniatures and then studied pastels before finally moving to oil paintings, right? So she actually, so that's actually missing a slide here too. There should have been 2 slides for each of them. So I'll add both of those in there with that. So she was older. Then all the women we've looked at were actually relatively young when they started painting, in part because they had family members. Most of them had family members that provided that, and ended up gaining recognition when they were really pretty young, like in their 20s, right? Or you could say that Angelica Kauffman was in her late teens when she started getting noticed, but like 20s, early 20s, mid 20s, most of these women were beginning to be recognized as well-known artists. But for Adelaide, it took longer. So she being 30 before she moved to oil paintings and started getting recognition it's not old today by today's standards, but was considered relatively old back then in terms of being just starting your career in that sense. She struggled to develop a clientele because she lacked the connections that other prominent women had, right? The whole thing goes back to networking. She didn't have the benefit of those networks that Elizabeth did or Angelica Kauffman did, right? And so ultimately, it took her a lot longer to not only gain this skill in painting, but then get the clientele and commissions and exhibits of her artwork to be noticed to start getting recognition for that. She was super shrewd, though, in everything that she did. Like, Adelaide was super impressive in just how she ended up getting recognized, because with I think more of a disadvantage than the other women we have kind of looked at. What ends up happening with this is that she decides to, on her own money, no commission, she paints a series of portraits of well-known painters in the French Academy at the time. And this tactic works. She paints them and she gives them to them, right? So she paints all these portraits of the most well-known Academy members, male Academy members, and gives them to them. And this caught their attention, and these were the people in that political power which allowed her to then be brought in, and it proved her ability to them. And they ended up bringing her into the Academy with Elizabeth at the same time, right? So on her own ingenuity, she found a way to circumvent the lack of networking and create that network by, obviously her skill and hard work, but by creating these portraits, not waiting for a commission and just creating the portraits and giving them to them, they were able to see her skill, and then they wanted to see more. And then they started, bringing her around, and that eventually got her into the Academy. She also had a massive focus on other women artists and accepted a small group of young women into her studio to train them. And many who ended up maintaining their own professional careers as portrait artists. One of her portraits, her self-portraits with 2 pupils, Mademoiselle Marie Gabrielle Capet and Mademoiselle Marie Marguerite. De Rosamond was one of her well-known portraits, which again I'll put in the fixed slide. Like, you know, we saw with putting her sister in the portrait, to put two of her students in her portrait shows her dedication to highlighting other women artists. And more importantly, it was smart because she was well known by this point when she does this portrait. It provided an introduction to these two women as legitimate artists. So she used one of her own self-portraits to promote two of her students to the art world, essentially. This work was praised by contemporary artists and helped continue to establish her reputation as a master painter in oils. So her area of medium was oil painting, and this was also unique because we've talked about the other women in pastels and things like that. Oil painting was seen as a more traditional, again, male artist medium, and she wanted to do oil painting over the pastel or the miniatures and things like that. She ends up being awarded a substantial stipend. So now we're here. This is where she some of the whole that there was conflict between her and Elizabeth also came from, besides them being admitted at the same time. She ends up getting a royal commission. She's not the Marie Antoinette's personal portrait artist, but she's given commissions from the king to paint the king's aunts. So she ends up having some royal connection, but it was not like the same as Elizabeth's was, right? She didn't have a strong connection to them. She took their money. They paid well. It was a good paying gig, and at the time, to have a royal commission was a sign of you having made it. However, so when the French Revolution ended up happening, she stayed in France and decided to adapt to the new government. Now, the one problem with this is that the French government after the revolution changed multiple times. There were 4 changes in the government system, ultimately, leading to Napoleon, which was not what the revolutionary idea of the French Revolution was. It's like, hey, we want freedom from the kings, and we're going to have a democratic system and a republic, and then it moved to an oligarchy with the reign of terror, where they were executing people left and right if they disagreed with the supposedly quote unquote revolutionary ideas. And then, well, maybe we should put the king back into place, not the one we executed, but his descendants. And then it was Napoleon who took over, who made himself emperor and started expanding and conquering all of Europe. So. And then when Napoleon was captured, he was put into exile. He escapes exile, goes back and raises up an army and tries again before he is killed. And then it goes to kingship, and then they go back to a constitutional monarchy. So the French Revolution is crazy. Their original goal, and then they went all over the place. Anyways, she adapted to all of this. So one of the things she did with the political changes in the early years, is actually she took a page out of her earlier playbook, and she exhibited 14 portraits of the deputies in 1791, which caught their attention, and she ended up receiving a commission from the Constitutional Assembly. Again, this is early years. This was when it was still a republic and they had democratic ideals. But she basically did the same thing that she had done earlier, right, and stuff like that. But it was smart because it got her connected to and accepted with the new changes in government. And she actually did portraits of Robespierre and Talleyrand, who were major players, and not only with the Constitutional Assembly, but they're both known. Robespierre is also known for the Reign of Terror and the kind of rule of the oligarchy period after that as well. And however, the commission didn't last because the constant changing government systems eventually led to the end of the commission. However, she didn't give up or stop at that point. She continued to advocate for women artists. She lobbied for improved positions for women artists, pressed for honorary distinctions for women to be recognized as legitimate artists, since they couldn't have positions as professors or office holders, which would allow them to be seen not only as professionals but get commissions and things like that. And she proposed an art school for impoverished girls. Talleyrand presented her proposal in 1791. It was rejected, but the school was eventually established in 1805 because of her proposal. And the other things got rejected too. So she wasn't successful, but the fact that she, from the earliest parts of her career, opened up her studio to women, put some of her students to introduce them to the art world and her self-portraits, and then continued with all this advocacy for women artists and impoverished girls throughout her lifetime, was massively impressive and shows her dedication toward women artists, and was probably one of the most tenacious and influential for trying to push for women during this period in time. So to me, super impressive with, what she tried to do and what she did accomplish. And also just like what she accomplished all on her own through kind of sheer force of will. Okay, that is where we're going to end for that. Again, if you want to see the correct last couple of slides and the artwork from Adelaide, check back a little bit later for the re-upload of those missing slides. Otherwise, that is what is it for the 18th century, and have a good week.